Everybody, I'm Vern Lundquist. In the summer of 1969, a freshman distance runner named Steve Prefontaine arrived on the Oregon campus to run for legendary track coach Bill Bowerman. This was the golden age of distance running, and Steve Prefontaine was a shooting star. By the end of his freshman year, he had become one of this country's elite runners, and in the ensuing 5 years, he created a legacy that endures today. But Steve Prefontaine was about much more than running. He was one of those rare individuals whose persona extended far beyond his athletic endeavors. Steve Prefontaine died in a car crash 20 years ago this week, just as he was reaching his peak as a runner. This meet and the athletes who are competing here pay homage to the spirit and memory of a man they knew just as Pre. This is his story.
There is a word for it, and it's called charisma.
He was a piece of work from the moment that he stepped into our lives.
When Steve ran, somehow all this became magic. I mean, really, it was like magic.
And it seemed like whenever he came out onto the track, the sun came out.
Steve was the best athletic competitor I've ever seen anywhere at any time.
Even though you didn't want to be, you were intimidated by his aura.
He knew that there was more to himself and his destiny than just a normal existence.
He had just begun to reach maturity when this show was over.
He just had that, whatever that is, I don't know. Actors have it, singers have it, some people have it, some people don't. Most people don't. He had a lot of it.
He was the benchmark that we all tried to, measure ourselves against. He was so ferociously competitive in his sport. He understood that he was getting close to the limits in ways that few people do.
He was the kind of guy that when it came down to compete, he was spitting fire.
Of all the great athletes that have worn our products on the field of battle, we made a statue of only one of them, and that was Steve Prefontaine.
He was the best distance runner in the world the year he lost his life. He'd run against all the good runners. Nobody could touch him. And that was a great loss to track and field when we lost Pre.
The time to hesitate is through. No time to wallow in the mire. Try now, we can only lose, and our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire. You know that it will be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire. Try to set the night on fire.
The Steve Prefontaine story, Fire on the Track, is sponsored by Nike, who encourages you to participate in the lives of America's youth. Kellogg's, with good...
His finest distance runner, Steve Prefontaine, was killed in an automobile accident in Eugene, Oregon. He died a little more than 4 hours after he had run the second fastest 5,000 meters in American history. He was 24 years old.
To an athlete dying young. The time you won your town the race, we cheered you through the marketplace. Man and boy stood cheering by, and home we brought you shoulder high. Steve Prefontaine's story begins in Coos Bay, Oregon, lumber country, where a hard day's work is rewarded with simply more of the same. Ray Prefontaine was a welder and a carpenter in the mills. He knew about hard work. He met his wife Alfreda in Germany during World War II. Steve was the second of 3 children, and the work ethic was instilled in Steve and his 2 sisters at an early age.
Already in grade school, they give certificates out for not missing a day during the year. It was so important to him not to miss a day. So 2 years in a row, he never was sick. But one time he got sick. It's the last part of the school year, and he was so disappointed. I guess he always had goals and wanted to be number 1.
As a boy, Prefontaine looked for an outlet for his athletic energy, but was too small for football and basketball. He discovered a love for competitive running in phys ed class. At Marshville High, he joined the cross-country team, and by the time he was a sophomore, Pre was a budding star.
I got a call from Walt McClure, and he was a track coach at Coos Bay, Marshville High School, that he had a young runner that he didn't want to screw up. That was his words. That fall, I went to the state cross-country meet. I was standing on a hill. I had my binoculars, and I was probably a good half mile, 700 yards away from the start. And I saw this guy that had the start position, but it was the look in his eyes, even from a half mile distance. The intensity that I saw in his face as the gun went off, that I thought, that's got to be Pre.
I was working, and we didn't see too many meets. And one day a lady came and said, "Mrs. Prefontaine, you should go to the meets. Your son, it's Olympic stuff." I still remember the words.
After failing to qualify for the state meet as a sophomore, Prefontaine vowed never to lose another high school race, and he never would. He went undefeated in his final 2 years, setting an American high school record in the 2-mile run as a senior. His prowess earned him an invitation as a schoolboy to compete in the AAU National Championships.
I noticed this this little kid hanging around the athletes in the dorm where everybody was housed. And he seemed to be especially hanging around the distance runners. Maybe Jerry Lindgren and Jack Batchelor and Frank Shorter.
I was a senior in college at the time, so I'm going, hey, pretty interesting. This young kid is pretty darn good, because I recollect he ran about 8:42 for 2 miles at the time, which incidentally at that time was faster than I had run for 2 miles. So I was impressed.
2 nights later, I saw him again in the shadows of the stadium in the evening as the 5,000-meter race is going to start. He's standing beside the competitors, and he's right in the middle of it, and he's got his Marshfield High uniform on. And I said, "Oh my God, that's Steve Prefontaine."
Running the 3-mile against athletes up to 10 years his senior, Pre would qualify for the team as an alternate.
He had been beaten by Jerry Lindgren and Tracy Smith, who were both longtime Olympians, and they turned at the finish line and to watch who was finishing behind them and making the team, and who should they see but this young man from Coos Bay, the future, running up at them.
Coming up, the Oregon years. Haywood Field, Eugene, named in honor of Bill Haywood, the coach that created the track and field tradition at Oregon. Haywood star runner Bill Bowerman followed in his mentor's footsteps, and in a quarter-century of coaching elevated running from a sport to a religion. Bill Dellinger, Bowerman's protege, would add to the legacy, first as a runner, then as a coach. Steve Prefontaine yearned to become another link in this long and storied tradition.
Somebody said, "Why didn't you pay more attention to Pre?" Well, I paid about as much attention as I would pay to anybody, because you start making love to some high school kid too early, and his head gets bigger and bigger. If I join the tail kissers, I'm just another donkey looking for another body to come out and run here.
But Bowerman acquiesced and seduced Prefontaine to Oregon with a personal recruiting letter.
The letter from the old master, so to speak, is the one that really impressed him. I had spent 2 years running down there back and forth trying to recruit him, and one letter from Bill did it.
Late summer 1969, America, a nation at odds with itself. It was the Woodstock generation and the space age. It was the best of times.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And the worst, an unpopular war planting the seeds of dissent in America's youth. It was this backdrop of liberal discord that greeted Pre upon his arrival on the Oregon campus. But in Bowerman's world, there was no time for politics, only running, and Prefontaine was forced to focus on the task at hand. After only his first collegiate season, he would burst into the national sports consciousness. People didn't know what to make of this brash, cocky freshman.
I called him World, and that was short for world famous. You come to college as a freshman, and you've been on the national team, and you have your USA national sweats, which is, that's as good as gold if you're a track athlete, and you're the hero of the town, and you've been to Europe competing, you're world famous. I said, Pre, next week I want you to run the 2 mile. That was before we had the 3 mile or the 5,000. He says, I don't run the 2 mile. And he turned and walked off, and I said, come back here, I want to tell you something. Where are you going to run next week? And he turned and walked off again, and he got about 3 steps back. He came back and said, well, I'll run the 2 mile, but I'm not going to like it. And he didn't like it, but he broke the school record.
If you're a runner, you're never completely satisfied unless you get a world's record. And I think it's a good indication of what I'm going to be doing this spring. I hope it's a good indication. This is my first meet of the new year, so that's not a bad way to start off the new year again.
During the next 2 years, Pre went undefeated against collegiate competition outdoors, set American records in the 5 and 3,000 meters, and won 2 NCAA cross-country titles. Pre embraced running and life with a controlled aggression. He feared no runner. Every distance a new challenge to be conquered. Barriers, once thought impregnable, crumbled before him.
Stories that were coming about back to us in the South about Prefontaine was that he was like a hero for whatever race he was in.
Talk about Muhammad Ali's float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. I mean, that was Pre. He went out and did it.
You know, I didn't know what to make of him exactly. You didn't see guys that young in that kind of competition be that bold.
He was a force, and he was very aware of that, call it power, charisma.
I couldn't understand why one of the best-looking girls on campus would come up and ask me for a date 2 weeks down the road, and he said, well, I don't know, I have to check my schedule. As a freshman in college, if you can imagine that.
We were like salt and pepper. You know, I was the bland person. I was introverted. I was married at the time. I was not a party goer. And Steve was the pepper. He was the spice. He was outgoing, extroverted, single, putting the moves on everybody. And we were just like Mutt and Jeff.
It was this style and panache that endeared him to the fans of Eugene. These were Pre's people. Victories were a foregone conclusion. Haywood Field was more than just home field advantage. It became the house that Pre built.
There's something about him that has this ability to absorb all this energy, this electricity that's in the stands, and you were part of it. I mean, you were part of that electricity.
To run against Pre in Oregon was a mistake if you really thought you were going to try to win, because when it was on his own turf, watch out. I mean, the feeling I had was, well, I'm running for second place here.
Coming up next, the trials and tribulations of Pre's Olympic dreams.
And I'm going to Oakland in 2 weeks to run against George Young, who holds the world's record in 2 mile, and the Russian who beat me this summer in Leningrad. and I'm looking forward to racing those two.
Long-term goal still 72 Olympics.
Long-term goal still 72 Olympics, yes.
George Young would present the biggest obstacle to Prefontaine at the Olympic trials, but Pre had home track advantage. The hometown fans were whipped into a frenzy for Pre's 5,000-meter showdown with Young. In classic Prefontaine style, he forged to the front early and never relented.
The roar of the crowd got to the point where at one time I remember standing in the middle of the field and yelling at Pre as loud as I could and not being able to hear my own voice.
Pre's people were hungry for victory, and he fed them what they wanted. An American record and bold predictions that the best was yet to come.
How do you feel? You're number one now.
Well, all I can say is I hope I can stay fit, and if I can run like this in Munich, I think I'm going to be pretty hard to stop.
After basking in the victory, Pre headed to Europe, where he set another American record. I could have broken the world record if I hadn't run the 1500 the night before, he boasted innocently.
We were in Oslo, Norway, and I was sitting up in the stands, and he and Bowerman were out doing a workout all by themselves. And the first thing he did in the workout was he paced himself to a 4-minute mile. And he went out very even split. I had a stopwatch, and it was a 62 flat, 3 flat. I think it was 4:00 point something. And then he did a ladder. Then he did his workout. But it was like, was he ready for the Olympics in '72? He sure was.
The games of the 20th Olympiad, Munich, Germany. These were supposed to be the happy games, but the serenity was shattered and the Olympic Games were changed forever by Arab terrorists.
There are men with guns beginning to train those guns on the rooms where the two heads were sticking out a moment ago of the Arab guerrilla lookouts. This is happening now, if you can possibly believe that, at the games of the 20th Olympiad.
The Olympic Games came to a stunning halt. With each passing hour, the tension built as the world watched in horror. The worst of all possible scenarios played itself out.
It now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone.
Despite divided opinion, IOC President Avery Brundage decided the games must continue. Every athlete had to search their soul for the courage to compete, including Steve Prefontaine.
They closed off the Olympic Village. I remember going to one of the isolated areas in the Olympic Village and having Pre climb over the fence and get out of there. And I remember one day taking him into Austria the day of the kidnapping just to get him away from it. He was quite upset. In fact, it felt like he did not want to run in the Olympics.
I think the initial reaction amongst all of us, we were all rooming together in the same room. We could look out from our balcony and see the room where all the Israelis had been housed. We could see the masked gunmen outside the rooms on their balconies. We all would stand there and look over on that day, and we thought early on that, you know, nothing's worth this. Nothing's worth human life. And everybody began to realize that the worst thing you could do would be to give in to the terrorist demands, which were really to disrupt the Olympics.
Had the terrorists spoiled it all for us? And the resulting answer among all the athletes was no. We're going to continue with this. We're not going to let the terrorists steal this from us.
The games commenced after a one-day hiatus and pre-qualified for the 5,000-meter final against a formidable field. Finland's Lassi Viren, already the gold medalist at 10,000 meters, was the pre-race favorite.
The 5K probably had as much expectancy, as much anticipation about it. There was so much talk about it. There was so many characters in it, larger-than-life people in it. In the Munich final, probably more than any other 5,000 final that there's been before or since.
Steve Prefontaine will be the Olympic 5,000 meter champion. I think he will break the world's record at 5,000 meters, but I think he will have to do it in Montreal. Because today, Steve Prefontaine, 21 years old, is running up against the very big boys. I think that Stewart's prediction of a last mile in 4 minutes is not unrealistic. That is what Steve Prefontaine will have to run if he's going to win this event today.
And that was how I saw it, really. I thought it would be hard, it would be a very fast race. And it'll probably be down to Viren and myself, with Prefontaine trying to chase us down in the last kilometre.
Prefontaine told me the other night, or about a week ago, standing in the lobby of the Sheraton München Hotel, he said, what I'm going to try to do is work it out so it'll be a pure guts race at the end, and if it is, I'm the only one who can win.
The fact that he could go there with no experience, being his youth that he had, and run that tough impressed me. I mean, it took me 3 Olympics to have the attitude that he had in his first Olympics.
And Steve Prefontaine is going to take the lead.
1 mile to go.
4 laps to go. That's it.
Pre has got to run that 4-minute mile now. He's got to.
He said to me, I'll run inside 4 minutes for the last mile. And I always got the impression that he thought he was the only one that could run inside 4 minutes for the last mile, whereas I knew I could, but I also knew 4 others that could as well.
Here's Viren going for the lead. It seems impossible that Prefontaine can outkick Viren.
Or Gamudi.
Vatanen is no place. Vatanen will not be a factor with his fabled kick.
Gamudi
is going for his 2nd gold medal of the games. Mohamed Gamudi is right with him, and so is Steve Prefontaine. The kid is showing all the guts in the world. He's hanging in there with the kickers. Prefontaine going for the lead with Gamudi. Viren is still there. Here comes Prefontaine. What is coming to you live from the Munich Stadium? Nobody in the world knows how it's going to turn out until they hit down the stretch, coming to the last turn.
Pre is running a great race. What guts.
Here comes Viren, going for his 2nd gold medal. And I think he's going to win it. But Gamudi could have a kick. I don't think so. Viren's going to win the gold. And here comes the Briton trying to pass Prefontaine for the bronze. It's going to be close. And it was Ian Stewart beating out Steve Prefontaine for the bronze medal as Prefontaine nearly collapsed in the last 5 meters.
University of Oregon for the Prefontaine Classic. I'm Vern Lundquist. The festivities are already underway and we'll be joining the live action in about a half an hour. Carl Lewis and Jackie Joyner-Kersee, 2 of our greatest Olympians, are among the many stars competing here to pay homage to the memory of Steve Prefontaine. The Olympic glory that Lewis and Joyner-Kersee have achieved in recent years stands in stark contrast to the disappointment that confronted Prefontaine in the summer of 1972. The Olympic experience had a profound effect on Pre. Returning from Munich, he underwent a metamorphosis, changing from an athlete of youthful exuberance to a man filled with vision and purpose, both on and off the track.
Steve Prefontaine narrowly missing in a bid for an Olympic medal. But as you said earlier, Eric, unquestionably he'll be back 4 years from now in Montreal.
You look back at that race in retrospect, he could have been the bronze medalist if he hadn't made the burst down the back stretch. But he would rather have gone for the gold and tried for that than get a sure bronze, and that just really typified the man.
He was crestfallen. I mean, he was just crushed. And I said, it was a nice race. I know you feel bad, but we've got to talk. He said, I've got nothing to say. I said, how old are you? He said, 21 or 22. I don't really remember what he was. And I said, and so you finished 4th in the world at that age. How bad's that? Well, he said, that's not too bad. And I said, did you run for 3rd or 2nd? No, you ran to win. You took the lead with a mile to go. You ran your butt off, and you finished 4th. How bad's that? Well, no, it wasn't that bad. What he needed was somebody to put their arm around him, to kind of hug him and say, it's okay, we understand. Priest people understand. And I was sort of the emissary for that, I guess. And so, goodness, he started talking, and 20 minutes later, he was all pumped up again. And I remember David Bedford walking by. And he shouted at Bedford, he said, I'll see you in Montreal, and I'll kick your butt. And it just took that long for him to get that excited.
The shattering of Olympic innocence in Munich was only a microcosm of the tumultuous events of 1972. Society witnessed the profound changes on an almost daily basis.
Can music save your mortal soul? And can you teach me how to dance real slow? Well, I know.
And in his post-Olympic depression, searching deep within his soul, Pre changed as well.
I think
what happened to him in the Olympics opened up his eyes, matured him.
You have to look at life differently. Absolutely, it will change you if you participate in the Olympic Games. And I think that had a huge impact on the way he looked at his sport and himself as well.
That change in his appearance was a change that was going on inside of him. And I suppose some of that was maturing. And probably that I'm going to get you next time.
Prefontaine finished his final year at Oregon undefeated, undaunted, and unemployed. The stark reality was that it was nearly impossible to train at a world-class level and earn a living.
It was like the Grapes of Wrath of track with his trailer. It really was very funny. I was very surprised when I came to Eugene and it's like, this is where you live? And then confiding in me that he was on food stamps. I was like, God, you're kidding. This is one of the world's best athletes. And it was quite a contradiction.
When you'd go to a European track meet and say an obscure Italian hurdler would come up and say, hey, let's go get our money and go partying. We'd go, what money? And we'd find out that our federation was getting our appearance money and athletes from other countries were getting theirs.
Pre galvanized his energy to try and loosen the AAU shackles. I love my country, but does it love me enough to let me go to Europe and get the experience I need to be the best distance runner in the world?
Pre was an angry voice for athletes' rights. He was always in trouble with AAU officials.
He really grabbed that situation by the balls, literally, and confronted the AAU, this old grand martial school of a bunch of old stuffies, and brought up some real uncomfortable situations.
They tried to tell him which races to run, and if they weren't the races against the very finest competition, if they wanted to run dual meets against Poland, and he wanted to run against New Zealanders or Finns, and very few, as they got better and better, who could give him a good race, then we had a conflict.
Much like baseball's Curt Flood, who challenged the validity of management to limit a player's right to free agency, Steve Prefontaine began to openly question the AAU's right to govern American track and field athletes.
But I'm not really trying to get under anybody's skin. I'm just trying to bring the problems to a head and an understanding to make the people of this country realize what's happening in amateur athletics. And what's happening is that the amateurs do not have the same benefits as, let's say, the Europeans. And I just like to bring this to the acknowledgement of the public.
He was a no-nonsense kind of guy. I mean, if he saw something he liked, he told you. If he saw something he disliked, he told you. It was kind of refreshing.
Steve forced me to be a rebel. We were outside of the governing body. We were supposed to run in an AAU meet in Germany and Italy, Russia, and they started out in Africa. And we bypassed the African meets. And I can remember just feeling so proud when I'd walk into the team meeting when we gathered together in Germany with Steve, and here Steve and I are walking in, in open defiance of the AAU. They were saying, you better get down here or else.
It's a fundamental conflict in the history of American sport that had to be resolved in favor of the athletes, and it was fought and won in the 2 years after Pre died. In 1978, the Amateur Athletic Act was passed, which guaranteed athletes' rights to compete when and where they chose.
We are definitely reaping the benefits of the things that he was speaking out against at that time. Track became professional soon after his death. Athletes had the freedom to go to Europe when they wanted, and to the current day, there's much more money in the sport that athletes are able to make a living.
Coming up next, Pre, it's the sneakers.
A lot of sacrifices to be an amateur sport in this country, considering it's so professionally oriented.
During the struggle against the AAU, Prefontaine rejoined forces with Bill Bowerman. Innovator as well as coach, Bowerman developed new track surfaces and used his cobbler skills to build running shoes. Along with Phil Knight, another former Oregon runner, they formed a shoe company, mass-producing models designed for Pre.
For me, at least, he set a tone for this whole company.
That ought to wake up the country club. I am not a role model. I got it. Oh, Mike, man.
That's cold, man.
If you're talking 1973, Nike as a company was only, as a brand, was only a year old. And Steve joined us at that time as an employee, and we were all the early pioneers. But Steve was really the catalyst. I mean, he was the reason that we were in business. And there couldn't have been a more perfect athlete than Steve for Nike, because he had a certain level of rebel in him, no question about it. He wasn't a rebel without a cause, he was a rebel with a cause.
Some folks are born made to wave the flag, ooh, they're red, white, and blue. And when the band plays hail to the chief, ooh, they point the cannon at you, y'all. It ain't me, it ain't me, I ain't no senator, son. It ain't me, I ain't no fortunate one.
He really had the vision. You could see it then and there, that the melding of running and business. But it was good because there was no sign that he decided that, hey, I'm going to go over to the corporate side of things and make money. It was still secondary to him that it was running. This is something I can do over on the side, but I want to run.
A runner first and foremost, Pre continued to burn up the track, setting 5 American records in 1974. His season was marred, however, with another defeat at the hands of his Olympic conqueror, Lasse Viren. Determined to exact revenge on Viren, Pre began promoting his own meets and organized a Finnish team tour to Oregon in the spring of 1975, once again overstepping the boundaries of the AAU.
It was really good for him to see the other aspect of track and field, that it isn't just you show up and run a race and that's all there is to it. On the other hand, I think his main motivation for that Finnish tour was to get the Finns over here during his prime season and just drum them into the track.
He was, you know, talking about the Finns coming over and how excited he was and getting ready to run against Lasse Viren.
And of course, at the last moment, Viren wasn't able to make it, and that kind of soured him a bit. But being Pre, he recovered, and it was a very successful tour.
Well, we had a very simple telephone call. He called up and said, gee, I really need you to come out and run this race because Viren's backed out, and he's not going to be there. And my response was, sure. It wasn't a problem. You know, we were good enough friends that he was asking me a favor, and I knew that even though he'd probably beat me, we were certainly going to have a fun race, and maybe he'd drag me along, and I could run pretty fast.
Next, Pre's final run.
Really concentrate and run a race. In a sense, maybe getting to run the race was a blessing. He could just sort of, that's what he did best.
Pre was in top form, destroying Shorter and the rest of the field, narrowly missing his own American record in the 5,000 meters.
I felt pretty incidental, really, in that last race, even though I finished second. You know, I realized at that point, at that particular distance, he was beyond me. I wasn't going to be able to beat him.
He was very quick to go from one victory to another challenge. He was not a great celebrator. He was a great party guy. He was a great celebrator of life. So it was fun to see him that night, really enjoying what had happened.
Pre celebrated the success of the meet at a party with family and friends. Mac Wilkins, reveling in his own victory that day, thought he had finally stolen the spotlight from Pre.
And I thought, by God, I finally got that Prefontaine. I beat him. You know, I'm going to get the headlines and the attention, and finally people will appreciate me. And, you know, sadly, but ironically, he topped that one.
In Eugene, Oregon, one of America's best hopes for the 1976 Olympics, long-distance runner Steve Prefontaine is dead. Prefontaine killed early this morning when his car flipped over. Prefontaine was 24.
For some reason or another, he moved very sharply to the left, cut left enough so that his wheel hit over the curb. They lifted the car enough so that when it hit the big stone embankment, flipped the car over on top of it. and basically crushed him, basically suffocated him.
To this day, nobody knows for sure what caused Pre to lose control of his car. He died before an ambulance arrived.
I was the last person to see Steve Prefontaine alive. I probably talked to him maybe 2 or 3 minutes before he died. In fact, we were continuing this conversation we've been having off and on all evening about how the success of the finish meet would perhaps play into some revamping of the amateur rules in the United States. And I said goodnight to him, and we may have even talked about running the next day. And I personally always felt I felt a lot of pain, really, in that, my first thought was, my God, he wouldn't have been here if he hadn't given me my ride home. And I don't know, I probably still feel bad about that. I don't know as if I've ever gotten over it.
I don't think, well, I'm confident that I'll never have a shock that great in my life.
Pre's people flocked to Coos Bay to pay final tribute to their favorite son. Steve Prefontaine was gone forever, but never to be forgotten.
For just as he was defiant towards those who hindered him, he was absolutely loyal to those of us fortunate enough to have found ourselves his friends.
I was sitting in the east stands and fairly high up, and boy, I'll tell you, I think I was probably the last one to leave the stadium. I couldn't go. You know, at the time I had a sense of loss because he was a guy that I kind of knew fairly well, but not that well. I don't think anybody knew him that well. And now that I look back on it, it's even more a sense of loss because I really feel like we had a lot in common. I sense a loss of what might have been in terms of a friend, and thinking about what might have been is an extra loss.
Smart lad, to slip betimes away from fields where glory does not stay. And early though the laurel grows, it withers quicker than the rose.
There's a lot of factors that make me run. But probably the biggest one is that I enjoy it, or I've acquired an enjoyment for it after so many years of running. It's part of my life now. Another reason would have to be the Olympic Games and trying for a gold medal. And the third thing would have to be competition. I love to compete against people.
He put more into his life in the 24 years that he was on this earth than many people do in a lifetime.
It's better to burn out than to fade away.
I said, Pre, of all your American records, the one I like the best is the fact that you came to Oregon and spent 4 years with never missing a workout, 4 years without ever missing a race. He says, Coach, I got to tell you, there was a few Saturday mornings when I really didn't feel like running.
Out of the blue and into the black.
Pre was a warrior, and if you didn't play by warrior rules, he didn't have much, much good to think of you.
And once you're gone, you can't ever come back. When you're out of the blue and into the black.
Prefontaine was this magnificent, compelling presence of physical possibilities.
The king is gone, but he's not forgotten. This is the story of Johnny Rotten. It's better to burn out than it is to rust. The king is gone, but he's not forgotten.
Unfortunately, a lot of things died with Steve Prefontaine. I think the sport in the United States would be substantially different
if he were still alive.
The moral of Steve Prefontaine is essentially fighting the good fight and fighting it very well and better every day.
The way he interacted with people was so much a result of his intensity and his focus on his running. And that's entirely understandable.
When I remember when that passed, I couldn't help but think that his voice, coupled with the force, the shock of his death, had certainly hastened that day.
A lot of my motivation to continue fighting the Federation in my own way and trying to work towards change was really generated by the fact that I wanted to carry on what was really very, very important to Steve.
King is gone, but he's not forgotten.
The story of an athlete dying young has been a compelling part of literature and life for centuries. In the tragic saga of Steve Prefontaine, we are reminded once again, sadly, why such a fate touches us all so deeply.
As you know, Kellogg...
The University